In a town where winters settle into the bones and summers pass like quiet hymns, a girl once stood alone with a racket heavier than her hands could bear. The cord was cracked, the net sagged slightly in the wind, and no one else was watching. Not yet. She wasn't the kind of child you'd point to and say, "That one. She'll be great." She moved with hesitation, not hunger. As if each step forward came after an argument with herself. But still, she moved. The ball bounced once, then again, and again. Each echo in the silence was an answer to a question she hadn't formed yet. Some athletes are shaped by ambition, molded by fire, driven by noise. Iga Świątek was shaped by stillness. She didn't scream for the world's attention. She didn't tear through her youth with declarations of destiny. She waited, she listened, and in listening, she heard what others missed. It wasn't about winning, not at first. It wasn't about legacy or record books or magazine covers. It was about the rhythm. The way the racket hummed when it struck the ball just right. The way breath synced with movement. The small sacredness of a point played perfectly, even in total obscurity. Razin is not Paris. It's not New York. It's not Melbourne. But something was born there. Not in fire. Not in thunder. In quiet persistence. In lonely mornings with no reward but repetition. There was no prophecy surrounding her. No miracle match as a child prodigy. No headlines. Just a father who once chased his own dream on water, passing on something quieter than ambition. Discipline. Spartan focus. A belief that excellence has no shortcuts, and character, no microphones. So here's the question. How does a girl trained in whispers survive a world that screams? How does someone built for peace step into a game of chaos? And not just survive, but change it? This is not a story of sudden explosions. Not a tale of overnight fame. This is something slower, more honest, something that lingers beneath the surface, like breath before a serve. The world would come to know her strokes, her stats, her streaks. But first, they must understand the silence she came from. Before the stadiums, before the pressure, before the storm, there was just Iga, and a feeling. A pull she couldn't explain. She chased it, alone, across faded lines and cold mornings. Never knowing where it would lead. But somehow, always believing it mattered. There are stories passed down by flame. Then there are those passed down in quiet breath, like air sealing a promise between generations. Before Iga Świątek found rhythm on clay, a different rhythm lived in her family home. Oars slicing still water, muscles moving in sync with tide and time. Her father, Tomas, had worn Poland's white and red, not on courts but in boats. An Olympian, disciplined to the marrow, but medals rust, and dreams passed down are seldom direct, they shift, refract. What he gave Iga wasn't a racket or a serve. It was structure. Up before the sun, not for applause but for the integrity of effort. She watched him, the way he moved through routine like ritual. And in that repetition, something settled inside her. A quiet contract, not with winning, but with the work. There was no pressure to follow. No speeches about greatness. Just an example, unwavering, unsentimental. It's easy to notice what is said. Harder to notice what is passed down in silence. And yet, it was that silence in which Iga started to shape. She didn't yet love tennis. But she respected effort. She honored discipline. She saw the steadiness of her father's life, and somewhere deep, she whispered back, "I understand." On days when the wind cut through the court like wire, when the nerves crept up her spine, she thought of rowing. Of water. Of rhythm. Of her father guiding boats through still dawns without an audience. There is a kind of mentorship that doesn't touch your shoulder but touches your soul. Iga's path wasn't forced. It was opened, not by fate, but by form, not by ambition, but by an understanding of how greatness can look like quiet endurance. And as she trained, young, unsure, outpaced, She returned to that still image of her father training alone. Not for medals, but for the integrity of the stroke. And something clicked, a kind of inheritance not of skill, but of mindset. There was no spotlight in their home. No boast, no hunger for headlines, just the echo of early mornings. And the shape of legacy when it chooses not to announce itself. The ocean did not give her victory. It gave her patience. And in every match to come, whether crushed in defeat or carved in triumph, she would carry that Olympic shadow. Not to be like him, but to remember that the path of champions is often silent. There are places where dreams are loud, stadiums, red carpets, neon reflections in midnight glass. And then there are places where dreams form quietly, unnoticed. Places like a training center in Warsaw at dawn. The lights inside the dome flickered faintly. Some mornings, the heater refused to cooperate. Other mornings, the silence was so deep it felt like time had stopped to watch her practice. She was small, a borrowed racket nearly dragged at her wrist, shoes half a size too big. But none of that mattered. What mattered was presence. Not proving anything yet, just arriving. Again and again, adults talked around her. Coaches with theories, trainers with focus charts, but Iga simply listened. She didn't yet know the names behind the games. No posters of stars on her bedroom walls. No clippings taped to mirrors. For Iga, tennis wasn't an escape. It was an entry into herself. Each strike of the ball was a footnote in a language she hadn't fully learned. But she was fluent in concentration. Other kids ran with noise, with bravado. She moved differently, like someone guarding something the world hadn't earned yet. Early photos show her mid-swing, eyes not just on the ball, but somewhere beyond it. As if chasing a shape behind the point. A form, a feeling. Back then, her name wasn't whispered in sports halls. She wasn't on any lists. But in her mind, a place of intricate silence, a slow awareness began to form. This wasn't a phase. It wasn't a hobby. It felt like truth. Not yet a path, but becoming one. No spotlight waited at the end of practice. Just nighttime, homework, sore wrists. But among cracked courts and halogen lights, a strange kind of devotion took hold. She didn't smile much, even when she won points. She didn't cry when she lost them. Not because she didn't feel, but because feeling, for Iga, was deeper than reaction. It lived below the words. And the world hadn't earned those words yet. Progress wasn't loud. It came like tide lines. You don't see them move until you look back. She wasn't fast-tracked through the rankings. There were no shortcuts, no scandal, no speech, only quiet work, days built on repetition. Mornings stitched together by muscle memory. There's a myth we like to believe, that greatness announces itself early. That prodigies glow. But here's another story, truer and quieter. Sometimes, greatness just shows up. On time, every day, and waits. She wasn't dazzling yet, but she was devoted. Warsaw didn't shower her with attention. The tennis world wasn't watching. But the girl herself? She was already listening. Because sometimes, when it's too early for crowds, a champion begins not with confidence, but with curiosity. And every quiet hour she gave to the game gave something back. Not success, not yet, but permission to keep going. 2 girls, 1 house, the same wooden floors that creaked in the mornings, the same wind chimes outside their window, dancing with the Polish breeze. But they moved differently. The older sister was louder in spirit, book-bound, driven, medicine-bound. She asked questions with her voice. Iga asked them with her silence. In family photos, they both smile. But Iga tilts inward, always inward. Some siblings compete. But this wasn't rivalry. This was shadow and light. Martina had chosen a path paved with textbooks, white coats, clean lines. Iga hadn't chosen yet. She was still listening, still unsure if the court was a destination, or just a detour. But something was stirring beneath the measured gaze. She didn't need to be the best in the room. She just needed to understand why she kept returning to the same cracked baseline. To the same echo of rubber against strain. Questions hung heavier than trophies at that time. Not, can I win? But, am I right to want this? Is quiet enough? There's a loneliness in self-discipline. Especially when no one asks you to do it. Especially when no one even sees. Sometimes, after school, she would train while Martina studied. One pursuing bodies, the other, movement, breath, precision. Both in search of control. Just in different languages. They cheered for each other. But only one was learning what it means to lose, in front of strangers. Iga didn't cry at home about missed points. She kept it quiet. She always had. Weakness, for her, wasn't in her game. It was in the unanswered whispers before sleep. Am I too soft for this? Will I ever stop fearing the crowd? What if I'm just good enough, and not more? But quiet doubt isn't the enemy. It's part of the shape of belief. And though she never quite said it, not to family, not to herself, she was beginning to want. Not to win, not yet, just to belong. And slowly, the court became holy. A space without comparison, where she wasn't the younger sister. She wasn't anyone's reflection, she was just there. In motion, in pursuit, and in time, that would be enough. Before the trophies, before the titles, it began not with certainty, but with a girl unsure if she deserved the dream pulling at her every morning. And still, reaching for it anyway. Some athletes sharpen themselves with rage, others with risk, but Iga Świątek discovered something different. Silence. At first, it was accidental. Barely a pattern, perhaps a coincidence. She'd win more when the world around her slowed down, when coaches stepped back, crowds faded, when the moment belonged entirely to breath. At tournaments before stepping on court, she started putting on her headphones. Not to block things out, but to let something in. A space between tones, a rhythm beneath words. Where the hum of her nerves could settle. Not hype music, not anthems, just something steady. Some players prepared to dominate. She prepared to disappear. Into movement, into timing, into that precise inner stillness where strategy becomes instinct. It wasn't about feeling powerful. It was about feeling quiet. Because tennis, for Iga, was not just a competition. It was a meditation. Match after match, she began to learn. She could hear more by saying less. She could feel more by thinking less. Every bounce of the ball before a serve like a breath. Every point, a return to zero. Coaches began to see it too. How she locked into points like a metronome. How adversity didn't fluster her, but pulled her deeper inward. She wasn't running from pressure. She was breathing through it. Because in her world, mental health wasn't backup, it was baseline. So she worked just as much with her mind as with her strokes. Exercises to name emotions. Tools to ground herself after errors. A psychologist, not as crisis response, but as companion in clarity. Not when things fell apart, but to keep them whole. Not to fix her, but to understand who she already was. And bit by bit, the results weren't just physical. A longer rally didn't shake her. Match point wasn't a storm. It was just the next breath. People wondered how she stayed so composed. Was it nerves of steel? A cold temperament? No. It was softness, practiced until it became strength. It was emotion, given somewhere to rest. Between each point was a ritual. Racket turn, breath in, bounce. Focus not on outcome, but on presence. Not to win the next point, but to belong inside it. Because chaos is part of the game, but panic is optional. And Iga learned to choose differently. To play not with fear or fury, but with space. To let pressure pass through her without carving itself into her. It wasn't magic, it was mental architecture. A learned way of holding balance in a world that demands collapse. She didn't raise fists to the sky. She didn't roar. She turned music on, she turned the noise off, and found, in that stillness, not escape, but entry. Into the calm she needed to chase perfection with grace, and the discipline to accept when perfection wouldn't come. This was her mind's quiet rebellion, against panic, against doubt. To say, "I am still here," and that was enough. Paris held a soft kind of heat that June. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that lingers on skin and memory. Roland Garros, 2018, junior level, yet to millions, invisible. But for Iga, it felt real. Not because of the crowd, there were barely any. Not because of the press, there was even less. But because she could hear everything. The scrape of shoes on clay. The low thud of a serve misfired. The breath between points. She didn't arrive as the favorite. Didn't carry a name heavy with headlines. She walked through the gates like someone entering a library. And treated every match like an unread page. There was no match of her life moment. No viral point that electrified the stands. Just quiet dominance. Moves rehearsed 1,000 mornings ago in Warsaw, now stitched together beneath a Paris sky. Her strokes weren't wild, they were written, as if transcribed from memory, not stirred by adrenaline. Opponents came and went, each carrying their own expectations. Iga didn't carry expectations, she carried stillness. Coach said she was calm. She wasn't, she was just present. Each rally unfolded without her needing to control it. She trusted angles, trusted breath. There was no noise in her game, no need to announce herself. She played like someone trying to solve something. Not her opponent, not even the tournament, herself. And when the final point landed, and victory became unavoidable, she didn't explode. She stood still, racket down, eyes forward, like someone who recognized a truth but wasn't surprised by it. She smiled, small, controlled, as if something private had been confirmed, but only to her. Not joy, not shock, just confirmation that all those early mornings, the silence, the repetition, the notebooks of thought, meant something. No trophy could translate it. No reporter could capture it. Because it hadn't been about the career. It had been about the calling. And now? Now it whispered louder. That Paris clay, so revered, so storied, had greeted her not with noise but with welcome. She didn't call herself a champion. She barely called herself a contender. But something had shifted. A seed planted, not in spotlight but in sanctity. Roland Garros wasn't a finish line. It wasn't even a beginning. It was a mirror. One that quietly said, "You belong here," and that changed everything. Tokyo held its breath, stadiums empty, seats taped off, silence thicker than air. The 2020 Olympics weren't what the world imagined. No crowds, no roars, no flags waving in rhythm. Just atmosphere, sterile and suspended. Just athletes, alone with their pressure. Iga had waited for this. Trained through seasons of doubt. Told herself she could carry more. Poland had watched her bloom. Media began to turn. There were whispers now. About medals, about gold. And she felt them, not as fuel, as weight. She arrived in Tokyo with steadiness, but steadiness isn't immunity. And expectation grew louder in all that Olympic quiet. She had dreamt of this, sort of. But dreams don't warn you about the eerie calm of an empty court buried inside a global crisis. Or the strange quiet after a misfired backhand that once earned polite applause. Now, just subtle echoes in high ceilings. She lost. Fast. Early. And there was no crowd to soften the blow. No noise to drown the inner voice. Just the sound of shoes brushing hardcourt as she left sooner than planned. In the tunnel, she didn't cry. Not visibly. But something broke inwardly, quietly, precisely. Not because of shame, but because she couldn't explain it. Why did it feel heavier this time? Why did the court feel colder? Why couldn't she find her breath? This wasn't just a match lost. It was identity fractured. She didn't know yet who she was when the game didn't love her back. And that not knowing burned. She stared at the ceiling of her hotel room. Stared too long. Kept her headphones on, even with no music. And in that pause, in that private unraveling, she asked herself a question far harder than, "Why did I lose?" She asked, "What am I actually chasing?" Because somewhere between the child practicing in Warsaw and the Olympian losing under fluorescent lights, something had drifted. Was this about others now? Was it still hers? The world hadn't seen it. The fans didn't hear it. But a storm had settled inside her, made of fatigue, doubt, and questions unnamed. And that storm wouldn't pass with rest or reassurance. It would take reinvention, not in posture or in form, but in thinking. That defeat in Tokyo wasn't an end. It was a mirror, and in its reflection, she'd have to dig deeper than victory. Deeper than rankings, to figure out what part of tennis still spoke only to her. Because sometimes the loss isn't to an opponent, but to a version of yourself you've outgrown. She didn't announce the change. There was no "New Iga" headline. No sharp pivot in style or stance. Just a quiet shift, the kind that happens somewhere between sleepless nights and honest mornings. She knew something had gone missing. Not from her game, from her center. The Olympics had hollowed her in a way victories never filled. And she couldn't keep sweeping doubt beneath discipline. Not anymore. So she stripped things back, not to start over, but to understand. Her team tightened, voices reduced, not because she feared advice, but because she needed space to listen to her own. A sports psychologist joined, not as an emergency, but as a lighthouse. Someone to help her name the storms before they broke. Together, they didn't talk about topspin. They talked about overwhelm, triggers, the pressure of eyes. They charted her thoughts like patterns, not problems. And in sessions where the racket never appeared, Iga reclaimed something more precious than form, clarity. That it was okay to struggle. That breathing wasn't weakness. That fear could be faced, not fought. Meanwhile, in the gym, she trained just the same, but with a different weight, intention. She read more, sat longer in quiet, not to check out of competition, but to check into herself. She didn't vow revenge on the rankings. She didn't circle names on the draw. Revenge wasn't what she needed. What she needed was return. To that place where tennis wasn't stress, it was stillness. To the rhythm of rally without the roar. And in learning to protect that inner space, she became harder to shake. Not colder, but sturdier. Not louder, but clearer. Matches followed. Some wins, some not. But the shift was already in place. She began to play with presence again, less for proving, more for participating. Not with detached calm, but with integrated courage, to show up when it hurt, to stay steady when it scattered. There would always be pressure, always the judging eyes, but now there was also a breath before serve, a phrase handwritten to herself in her notebook, a team who saw her not as asset but as person. And one day, quietly, without fanfare, she walked onto court and didn't fear being seen. Not because she had nothing to lose, but because she had returned to something stronger than image, stronger than fear, herself, and that changed everything. Paris again, but not the one we remember. No bustling streets, no murmurs crowding cafes. This Paris was muted. Roland Garros, emptied of its usual din, stood like a chapel in lockdown. October skies hung lower, and silence swept over the clay like an uninvited guest. It was 2020. The world had paused, but tennis, somehow, kept moving. And Iga Świątek returned, not as a junior, not as a promise, but as a question the sport had yet to ask. Ranked 54th, no expectations, no headlines heavy with her name. But she felt known here. Not by people, by the dust, by the light that filtered down just so. By the ghosts of rallies played long ago under softer suns. Others trained to adjust, She adjusted by returning inward. Because the quiet didn't scare her anymore. It steadied her. She had rebuilt in silence. Now, she would bloom in it. Match by match, the story refused to follow the script. Top seeds fell. Commentators reached for adjectives they weren't prepared to use. And Iga, calm, firm, floating, simply played. No shouts. No fist pumps for cameras. She walked through each win slowly, as if pacing her way home. Against Halep, no stumble. Just precision. Against Trevisan, against Podoroska, same rhythm, same breath. Her game wasn't loud. It was layered. A kind of intelligence disguised in softness. Power hidden inside poise. People asked, where did she come from? They had asked too late. She'd been here already, just no one noticed. But Clay remembers. Paris remembers. She stepped into the final not as an outsider, but as a presence the tournament had quietly accepted. And in that last match, when eyes finally dared to expect, she did not flinch. Every shot had history in it. Every rally, an old argument resolved. After the final point, a winner on the run, angled like a breath, she did not collapse. She didn't scream. She simply stood, eyes wide, but still. Like recognition meeting realization, the trophy came, the interviews, the flood of questions from a world just opening its eyes. But what mattered had already happened. Not the title, not the record, but the return of peace, of presence, of that moment when the racket hums, the footwork flows, and the game becomes simple again. She hadn't played to prove. She had played to remember. What it feels like to let your mind go quiet in a world that forgot how. And Paris, under gray skies and softer noise, had whispered back. You are ready, not for fame, not for legacy, but for everything that comes next. And this time, she wouldn't run from it. After Paris, the silence broke. Not inside her, but around her. Cameras leaned in, headlines circled. Voices rose with praise and expectation, sometimes indistinguishable from pressure. She carried none of it like a crown. More like a coat, hands in pockets, head slightly bowed, adjusting in private. People called her a star now. WTA champion, a revelation. But Iga never wanted to be light in anyone's eye. She wanted to stay close to the ground, closest to herself. The world started asking more. More interviews, more appearances, more definitions of who she was, what she meant, what would come next. But what mattered most to her could never be fully explained on paper. Not the rituals, not the pace, not the inner measurement of how deep into herself she had to go just to make the noise feel manageable. So she turned inward again. Found what steadied her, ice after matches, part shock, part therapy. Journals, marked with tiny handwriting, kept private not out of secrecy, but necessity. To write, unfiltered. To translate mind into shape. She read, still, books about thought, about emotion, about pattern and presence. Not to escape, never to escape, but to understand how she moved, how her brain spun in the quiet between matches. Others noticed her routines. They called them quirks, superstitions, but they weren't. Each one, each breath before serve, racket touch, bounce, glance, was a tiny rebellion against chaos. Structure was her comfort, still water in a roiling world. And when she played again, under brighter attention, she didn't pretend it wasn't harder. The questions got sharper, the tournaments heavier. She could hear the rumblings. Can she do it again? Will she stay consistent? Is she the new face? But Iga heard differently. Not challenge, but noise. And she wasn't here for the noise. So, she returned to what she'd learned in Tokyo, and unlearned even before that. Breathe, step, lock in, because attention is a wind that knocks the unready sideways. But she had built a center. Her serve wasn't just a shot. It was a meditation, a reset. Her backhand, not just muscle and angle, but discipline bending into art. And in between matches, she reminded herself. Calm is not absence. Calm is resistance. It's carrying pressure without letting it own you. It wasn't easy. Some days, the calm cracked. Some days, the questions seeped in deeper than planned. But those were the days that made her sharper. Harsher with herself, sometimes, but also more humane. She gave herself space. And in that space, she guarded what mattered. Not the title, but the truth behind it. That she hadn't become someone else. She just let more of herself into the light. The lights grew hotter, the questions louder, the audience wider. But inside her, among the breath, the bounce, the ritual, there was still one sound louder than all of them. Silence shaped into rhythm, and rhythm shaped into peace. She didn't arrive with proclamations. No declarations of supremacy, no chest-thumping bravado. Just her team, her rituals, her stillness, and the clay, always the clay. 2022 unfolded like a hymn, slow at first, then impossible to forget. What began as a few quiet winds became a current she couldn't quite feel, but couldn't escape either. Match after match, she did not lose. Not in Dubai, not in Doha, not in Indian Wells or Miami, not in Stuttgart, Rome, Paris, 37 straight. She moved like she'd rewritten tempo itself. Opponents stumbled not just on her game, but on her calm, on the eerie way she could read a rally 4 shots early, on the silence between her serves that somehow made the pressure louder. There was no signature roar, no signature pose, only rhythm, a rhythm that made every match feel familiar, not predictable, but inevitable. Not because she overpowered, because she outlasted, not just physically, mentally. She would arrive at the baseline like the match just began, no matter how far ahead she was. She protected games point by point, like each one was the first. The world called it dominance. She called it presence. When people asked how she could keep this up, her smile would flicker, just for a breath, as if they didn't understand what it cost. That perfection, even graceful, exacts a price. Each victory built pressure. Each win demanded she maintain not just excellence, but invisibility. No breakdown, no weakness, no flicker of fear, because now, people watched her differently. Every match had subtext. Was the streak still alive? Was she still the best? Fans turned to believers. Skeptics turned to watchers. And the weight of all of them, their awe, their need, gathered silently behind her in tunnels and press rooms and quiet hotel nights. But she kept to her rituals. She read when airports blurred into repetition. She journaled through fatigue, not away from it. She iced sore legs, practicing the mundane alongside the extraordinary. And when she stepped onto the court, the rituals softened the noise. She didn't measure herself against the streak. She measured herself against the moment. One ball, one breath, one point. The rest, the wins, the banners, the headlines, they weren't the reason. They were, at most, echoes. Because the truth was, she didn't need to win 37 times to prove herself. But doing so taught her something deeper. That excellence isn't a surge. It's a discipline. And when practiced without obsession, it doesn't erode you. It anchors you. Until one day, she would lose. And when she did, the world would ask what it meant. But she already knew. She had already won something more essential. Not because she was the best for a season, but because she played, again and again, like someone returning to a truth. The streak wasn't the story. The way she carried it was. She kept winning. And with each win, the rooms grew smaller. Not literally, but in feeling. In how the air carried expectation. How it clung to her, like fabric too tight to shrug off. People smiled when they spoke to her, but their questions narrowed. Less curiosity, more confirmation, of consistency, of dominance, of perfection. She answered them all, kindly. But inside, the questions began to turn toward herself. Not, can I? But, should I keep carrying all this? This record, this rhythm, this idea of who and what she was supposed to be. Excellence, she was learning, didn't always feel like power. Sometimes, it felt like fatigue braided into every limb. Like waking up and realizing you've won again, but don't quite remember how. The silence that once gave her peace now began to echo back something heavier. Not calm, but expectation made quiet. Every match she played was a memory being shaped for someone else. A line in a headline. A stat on a screen. But for her, where was the joy? Sometimes, after back-to-back wins, she found herself sitting on the locker bench longer than necessary. Not hurt, not tired, just distant, as if the part of her that played the match hadn't returned yet. As if she had left a piece of herself out there, with every point that demanded perfection. No one saw it, maybe a few sensed it. But Iga didn't perform sadness. She performed balance, even when she wasn't sure she had it. She kept reading, writing, practicing, hoping that routine could carry her where energy couldn't. Some days it did, other days, she wondered what would happen if she let go. Not of tennis, but of the idea that she must uphold something sacred every time she stepped on court. What if she played messy? What if she played light? Could she still belong? There is a deep kind of loneliness in maintaining brilliance. Because admiration rarely asks about exhaustion. People notice when you drop, not when you drift. And she began to feel it. Not in matches lost, but in moments lost. Little flickers of joy gone unnoticed. Little notes of freedom swallowed by order. No one forced her into this mold. She had carved it herself, with intention. Structure had saved her once. But she wondered if it was now the very thing pulling her under. Would people love her if she let herself crack? She didn't know, but she wanted to find out. Not through collapse, but through honesty. Through whatever came next, even if it wasn't as sharp, as perfect, as exact. Perfection had taken her far. But maybe, just maybe, imperfection might bring her back. Do you want to be like Serena? The question came often, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp. A compliment, wrapped as a curiosity. A benchmark set not by style, but by stature. She'd smile, polite, careful. But inside, the answer never fit into a soundbite. Because Serena wasn't just a player. She was an era, a force of nature rewritten in serves and survival. To walk that path meant inheriting more than titles. It meant becoming a monument, standing tall, unmovable, relentless. But Iga wasn't made of stone. She admired Serena, not just the ferocity, but the courage. Not just the trophies, but the transparency. The way she bore pressure with volume and velocity. But Iga didn't carry her game like a torch. She carried it like a question. Like a poem half-written, rewritten in low tones. She didn't want to be the next. Not of Serena, not of anyone, because that was another way to vanish. She'd seen it happen, how the world bends quiet athletes into familiar shapes, demanding they roar like lions when their gift is the whisper. They call it legacy, they mean repetition, but Iga knew her rhythm was different. Fewer headlines, more margins. Less defiance, more intention. When she watched Federer, it wasn't the forehand, it was the grace between points. When she admired Djokovic, it wasn't dominance, it was resilience shaped into ritual. When she studied Nadal, it wasn't the clay, it was the loyalty to suffering, the honest friction. She learned from them all. But she did not echo. Because her greatness couldn't be inherited. It had to be interpreted. She didn't need to match their shrines. She needed to build her own altar, one made in stillness, with space left for change. It wasn't fame she feared. It was becoming unreadable to herself. She didn't want to be the icon in neon. She wanted to be the person, still walking to the same song under the same set of headphones, even when the cameras multiplied. Because Serena made people believe. And belief can be blinding when it's projected outward. But Iga, she wanted a belief that whispered inward. Not for history to write her in capital letters, but for the page to sound like her. Some will call it modesty. Some will call it caution. But that's not what it is. It's authorship. It's the refusal to hand over your story to the voices outside the lines. When they ask, "Do you want to be Serena?" she thinks of the weight behind that sentence. The fire, the armor, the orbit. She thinks of all that she is becoming, not in reaction to anyone, but in response to herself. And her answer floats between breath and answer. No, not Serena, just Iga. In Poland, the seasons shift like memory, slow, layered, and felt before they are seen. And somewhere between dusk and history, a girl with a racket became something else. Not just a champion, a symbol, not asked for, not demanded, just given. Children said her name the way they say the names of constellations. Teachers wrote it on the board beside words like dedication and mindfulness. Small towns painted murals, not explosive, not fierce, but soft, measured. A girl looking ahead, not up. She didn't win for claps. She didn't play for parades. But her country watched and wondered how such steadiness could hold so much weight. Suddenly, she was everywhere. Billboards in Warsaw with her eyes half lowered, like thought had interrupted the pose. Magazine covers that tried to label her queen, hero, prodigy. None of them quite fit. Because Poland didn't see her in banners. They saw her in moments quiet enough to be real. A high school hallway, where a girl retied her shoelace tighter, thinking maybe she could stay in class just a little longer. A boy who read about her between trains, thinking strength might not require noise. She had become a kind of mirror, not reflecting back brilliance but intention. Quiet longing shaped into form. But with symbol comes shadow. With reverence, responsibility. And though she never asked to carry that weight, it came. In every match, in every loss she couldn't allow herself to simply own. Because now, others owned parts of her. She didn't have a nation's pressure carved into contracts. The pressure was self-built. Because it's one thing to disappoint a coach. Another to feel like you've dimmed your country's pride. She never let it show. But inside, she measured her days differently. Not just by scores or training yardage, but by whether she'd honored the part of her people believed in. There were days the noise grew too close. Days when applause felt like demand in disguise. Days when she wondered if they'd still love her without the wins. But she kept steady, because she remembered, she was not a national monument. She was a person with breath and books and sadness she refused to glamorize. She reminded herself how she got here, not through genius, but through gradual, invisible persistence. She remembered the cracked quartz of Razin, the rituals, the lone hours, home, and somehow, those memories held her upright beneath the banners. She didn't reject the crown, but she wore it differently. As fabric, not metal. As silence, not ceremony. Because legacy, to her, wasn't about being worshipped. It was about being believed in. It was about thousands of kids picking up a racket and thinking, not, "I want to be famous," but, "I want to feel like she looks alive inside herself." And that was the crown. Not the trophies, not the titles, but the chance to be real enough that someone else might choose themselves. She didn't speak. Not at first. The war had begun, sharp, unfolding just across Poland's eastern edge. Ukraine. Smoke where trees once stood. Children crossing borders with bags far too small for all the leaving they carried. Iga watched, not from afar, but from proximity that made concern feel like blood memory. And still, she didn't post. Didn't perform outrage. Didn't stride into statements. She listened to stories from border towns, to silence on the radio between bulletins. And one morning, before stepping onto court, she took out a small ribbon. Blue, yellow, threaded it into the lace of her cap, fastened it loosely near her heart. Didn't ask if it'd be noticed. Didn't need it to be. Because this wasn't activism as gesture. This was empathy translated into presence. Into placement. Some athletes drape themselves in slogans. Others fall silent, fearing misstep. Iga never feared silence. She lived beside it. But this silence was different. It was the kind that begged to be broken not with noise, but with knowing. The ribbon wasn't protest. It was witness. It said, "I am aware." Without pretending to understand. Without narrating pain not her own. Reporters asked, what did it mean? She answered, briefly, about humanity, about not wanting lives reduced to footage. And then no more. Because she wasn't lifting her voice above the fray. She was choosing not to look away. Each match that followed, the ribbon stayed. Small, unwavering, often unseen by cameras, but visible to those who needed it. Ukrainian players saw it. Fans saw it. Children watching from shelters saw it. They didn't see a savior. They saw acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is the least and the most anyone can offer. She donated quietly. Fundraisers, partnerships, resources moved in the background. Not because it was an obligation, but because she remembered what it felt like to stand in a game where your name doesn't protect you. And while bombs didn't fall on her hometown, she felt the wind shift. Felt the closeness of fragility, how borders are just quiet promises until they're tested. On court, she kept winning. But the game felt heavier. Victory didn't erase reality, it momentarily sheltered her from it. She wore the ribbon across Paris, across Rome. Into press rooms that forgot to ask, into atmospheres that thought sport was untouched. But she knew, nothing is untouched when people bleed. And winning with empathy meant more than ranking points. It meant reminding the world, in gesture, that greatness is not immunity, it's responsibility. She didn't write essays, didn't film messages, didn't campaign for retweets. She just showed up, with skill, with grace, with the weight of history in cotton strands pinned to her chest. There's power in protest. There is also, sometimes, power in quiet alignment with the hurting. And in every step she took toward a baseline, she carried both. The lightness of mastery and the gravity of empathy. The ribbon never changed color. But in time, it became something more. Not decoration, not statement, a promise that she would not be too busy winning to remember what's worth standing for. She stood at the net, shook hands, packed her bag. The score said she'd lost. But that wasn't the story. Not this time, because something had changed in her. Not how she hit, not how she moved, but how she carried defeat. It didn't sting the same way. Didn't spiral. Didn't linger like mist on skin. She walked off the court and didn't flinch when the cameras caught her smile. Not a grin, but a small, open curve of peace. Because now, she knew. Losing didn't take anything away from her. It revealed something else. A new grace. A new steadiness. Not despite the loss, but through it. She had played her game. Not her best, maybe. Not perfect, but not hollow. Not panicked. Not pretending. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. She didn't run to fix it. Didn't dissect the failure in front of microphones. She let the loss breathe. Because now she understood. A career is made not just of titles, but of how you leave the arena when none are waiting. Once, she feared that. Feared the silence after failure, the judgment carried by eyes too quick to forget context. But now, she met that silence without apology. Because she had learned. Elegance isn't just in winning. It's in continuing. She still iced her legs. Still studied footage. Still asked questions. But not from panic. From curiosity. What did I miss? Where did I grip too tightly? What rhythm escaped me? No self-blame. No spirals. Just investigation. Like all great minds, she searched the loss not for shame, but for instruction. And in analyzing the cracks, she felt something odd. Pride. Because she hadn't cracked. Others did. Others folded under the weight of their own standards. She stayed upright, even when the shot went long, even when the match slipped. She stayed present, and that was new. There had been a time when losing left her hollow, when it called into question everything. Now, it just ended. And she walked through it, not unscathed, but unshaken. Some victories come with silverware, others with stillness. And this one, this strange, quiet victory found inside defeat, brought her closer to herself. She didn't need to prove resilience anymore. She had lived it, point by point, loss by loss. She understood now. Even falling can be an expression of clarity. To try, to fail, to learn, and to not allow any of it to diminish your belonging. Because perfection is unlivable, but presence? That lasts. And as she sat alone in the locker room, unwrapping tape from her fingers, she smiled again. Softer this time, not because losing felt good, but because it no longer felt like erasure. She was still here, still whole, still Iga, and that, more than any trophy, was a win. The girl with the headphones, the one who bowed awkwardly after wins, who walked off court like she didn't quite know where to place her hands, she's no longer here. Not vanished, but changed, because time does that, not like a wave, more like a sculptor. Small movements, edges softened, others sharpened. And the version of Iga Świątek the world had grown to know, the quiet one, the prodigy with preternatural calm, she had made room for someone else. A woman, still quiet, but no longer uncertain. She speaks differently now, slower, but with weight. Her shoulders hold matches like they've carried whole seasons. Her focus, refined, not just because of wins, but because of what it cost to arrive at them. There are scars now, not the kind you see, the kind you earn. From matches that pulled more than sweat, from expectations that etched lines beneath the eyes, from every time she stood in a tunnel and had to remind herself that fear isn't final. She no longer looks surprised after victories. Not because she expects them, but because she recognizes them. She knows what it takes. Not just the drills, but the days when you want to quit and smile anyway. The mornings where self-doubt eats from your plate. The nights where the racket feels like both comfort and burden. She knows the weight of her own name now. How it echoes in press rooms. How it lands in countries she's never been. How it carries for others, young girls watching, looking for a name that tells them, yes, it's possible. And she steps into that shadow, not with pride, with purpose. She reads still marks passages that speak to something deeper than sport. Still walks slowly when the world gets loud. But there is steel now, beneath the softness. She has learned to hold her ground. To speak when needed. To set boundaries no one else understood she needed. She's not chasing legacy. She's living it, match by match. With kindness. With stubborn grace. No more asking if she belongs. No more waiting for affirmation. She serves like she means it. Moves like she's writing her own blueprint. Wins with eyes wide open. Loses without losing herself. She is no longer only the future. She is the present. And with every swing, every ritual repeated with new resolve, she reminds herself. I am not the girl they remember. I am not the echo of someone else. I am not here by accident. She is here, not to be anyone's next, but to be entirely her own. She carried a book in her bag, next to her rackets. Not a match journal, not matchups or statistics, but philosophy, memoir, poetry, words that didn't orbit sport but circled the self. Thoughts that bent the mind inward, toward discipline, toward stillness, toward why. Before matches, while others blasted music or practiced their roars, Iga read. Not to prepare, to arrive. Because the court wasn't a battlefield for her. It was a mirror. And you don't step into your own reflection hurriedly. She learned that the mind doesn't follow orders, it responds to invitation. So she invited clarity, sentence by sentence, page by page. It wasn't superstition, it was structure. Literature as alignment. So the chaos outside couldn't rewrite the calm within. Between matches, she absorbed the cadence of thinkers, the rhythm of those who'd withstood storms without raising their voice. And in their quiet defiance, she saw something familiar. Because Iga Świątek did not play fast. She played whole, each point assembled like a line of verse, measured, consistent, unhurried. She wasn't trying to rush the win. She was trying to write it. And like all trusted authors, she understood that patience was not delay, it was intent. You saw it in the way she constructed her rallies. Not just to outplay, but to unlayer. To soften the edges of an opponent's will before drawing the line. Her movement wasn't flashy. It was fluent, an essay in motion, paragraphs composed in footwork and spin. Some players explode. She unfolded. There was always a sense that her mind stayed half a beat ahead, not dominating, but anticipating. Because she didn't need to overpower. She needed to understand, and that understanding, of self, of balance, of edge, wasn't born from instinct alone. It came from reflection, quiet rooms, late-night annotation, margins full of meanings no crowd would ever see. This wasn't detachment, it was devotion, to a kind of inner architecture that made her unshakable. Not because emotion was absent, but because it had been integrated. Some called her cerebral, distant, as if composing yourself was a flaw. But they missed the truth. She felt everything. She just chose where to place it. She knew the cost of letting noise walk through the door uninvited. So she built thresholds, rituals, pages. Before each match, she peeled back distraction and stood there, still, centered, with racket in one hand and unread sentences lingering in the other. Not holding wisdom like armor, but like breath. In and out. She once said she didn't just want to be good. She wanted to be better, for herself. More precise, more present, and maybe no one saw the proof. Not in poses, not in tweets. But in the way she found her footing without needing applause to tell her where she stood. The court was never separate from the page. Both were places of permission. To think, to feel, to unfold. And when she served, not just balls but chapters, you felt it. Not a storm, a sentence underway. And everyone tuning in became, for a moment, a reader. A breath in, a breath out. Before each serve. Before each match, before each morning made heavy with expectation. She had learned to measure time not by trophies but by the spaces between thoughts. A good day wasn't one without fear, but one where she met fear and didn't flinch. She no longer ran from the noise. She walked through it, the interviews, the commentary, the swells of praise that flickered toward pressure. Because that's what happens when people name you the best. They forget you're still becoming. But she remembered, and each breath became a boundary between herself and the storm. Each exhale, a way to return. To center. To now. In the locker room, others scrolled. She sat, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing. Silence no longer frightened her. It was her companion, her compass. Breathing reminded her that control wasn't out there. In the rankings, in the draw, in how the world spoke her name. Control was inward, in how she responded, in how she remained. There were days the pressure ballooned, the weight of carrying not just wins, but wonder. Because people didn't just root for her. They looked to her, to be the calm one, the kind one, the consistent one, and sometimes that became a cage. But breath was a key. She'd press her palm to her chest and wait. Wait until her heartbeat no longer sounded urgent. And in that waiting, clarity. Not to play perfectly, but to play presently. There had been matches she barely remembered, won, but lost inside distraction. Now, she made room for the memory. To place herself fully inside each point, whatever the outcome. Because presence mattered more than dominance. More than legacy. More than myth. Some fans now knew her stats by heart. Her streaks. Her seeds. Her titles. But she knew something deeper. How she felt when it was just her and the ball in the air and the moment unfolding, one shot at a time. She had grown into someone who didn't just play the game but witnessed it. From inside herself, a student still, always, but now also a teacher, not by instruction but by example. To breathe is to answer, not to the world, but to the part of you that asks gently, "Are you still here?" And her answer, again and again, was yes. Still here, still grounded, still Iga. The girl from Razin never left. She had just grown lungs that knew how to carry weight without turning it to burden. And every time the racket lifted, and the crowd fell back, she came home to that same breath. The inhale of readiness, the exhale of return, and in that rhythm, she moved forward. What does greatness sound like? Not the roar of a crowd. Not the cheer after a forehand winner or the tension before match point. But something smaller. A breath before serve. The hush after a long rally. The subtle exhale when everything lands just right. For Iga Świątek, greatness has never been thunder. It has been echo. A ripple moving outward from still waters, not loud, but lasting. She doesn't measure her impact in fame. She measures it in feeling. In how the game feels in her hands. How her feet settle into courts from Rome to New York. How, even in the loss, she knows she gave something whole. Decades from now, we may not remember every scoreline. But we'll remember the presence. The way she carried herself like silence made visible. Strategy stitched to soul. Emotion hidden not to disappear, but to be deciphered. She never chased legends. She walked parallel to them. And in doing so, carved a lane where nuance had room to stretch its legs. The crowd will always want volume. Victory that screams. Defeat that crumbles. But Iga taught us another kind of volume. One that doesn't ask for attention, but holds it. With curiosity. With patience. With presence. Because greatness doesn't always pulse. Sometimes, it hums. A steady note beneath the chaos, quietly anchoring a storm. And the girl who once stood alone in Razin, unsure if she belonged, became the woman who moved through the world not by forcing space, but by becoming it. It was never about dominance. It was about duration. Not the strikes landed, but the intention behind each one. Not about rewriting the game, but restoring its rhythm to herself, each time she picked up a racket. And that rhythm, that pace that only she knew, now lingers in the air long after the match ends. Invisible, but felt, an echo in the wind, of breath, of balance, of a presence that didn't need to convince, only to be. What does greatness sound like? A single bounce, a clean connection, a breath drawn in, and released without fear. It sounds like Iga, and even when she's gone from the court, it remains.